I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their life by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Brian Eggert, to the Real Mental podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's very fun to have you back because I'm so curious to hear your take on the movie we're going to talk about today, which is called Project Hail Mary. So before we start, why don't you just give a little thumbnail about who you are and what you do to the listeners?
Yeah, I write for deepfocusreview.com. I'm an independent film critic. I've been doing this for about almost 20 years now. You can find my reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, and I'm at Deep Focus Review on Letterboxd and Blue Sky.
Okay, so you are a serious film critic.
Yes, yeah, I tend to take it a little bit more seriously than I think some other online critics, but that's not to put them down. Everybody's got their own way of doing things, and I come from a background of scholarly education in film criticism, so that's kind of the approach that I take, sort of at the intersection between a traditional review and critical analysis.
Terrific. So it's fun because I'm at the intersection of psychology and cinema, and you're at the intersection of critical review and scholarly analysis. So that's very fun. So we're both kind of intersectional.
Right.
All right. Well, let's get into it. What did you think of Project Hail Mary?
So I approach this a little differently than I do most movies and most book adaptations as well. I was a huge fan of this book, and I couldn't really separate that watching this movie. And so my review of it at the time was very much like this is going to be kind of a comparison contrast between the book and the movie. And I think, going into this, I probably shot myself in the foot by reading the book, and especially as in close proximity as I did to seeing the movie. That said, I did watch it again today before this podcast, and I enjoyed it a little bit more, and the things that nagged at me about the adaptation were maybe a little less prominent. But I think my argument that I detail in my review is pretty spot on in terms of how I feel about it now, which is that they just make these slight changes to the material to make it more accessible, less challenging, more audience friendly. The book is very much focused on secularism and education, the importance of education and the importance of science. Ryland Grace is a guy who loves teaching more than anything. And, spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen this yet. I think everybody's kind of seen it, though. At the end, for instance, in the book, he chooses to stay on the alien planet. And it's not even an option for him to go back, and he's completely fine with that. So there are little things that they change that don't seem like major changes, but I think it's kind of like an ideological shift from science forward to we're just going to kind of gloss over the hard science, which is very much like so the author also wrote The Martian, and The Martian was adapted from book to screen in a way that really talked through, I think, the science and didn't give the audience short shrift on that. And Project Hail Mary, I think, really deprioritized that aspect of it and just sort of focused on the relationships and the emotions of it, which is a fine way to do things. But when I've seen the alternative, or at least read the alternative, it was very frustrating for me as a viewer to watch certain moments that were glossed over and replaced with like chummy montages of bowling in a Home Depot or something like that, So I appreciate the energy of it. I appreciate that it plays well for an audience. But for me, it was, I think, maybe missing the point of what the author was going for. And I think it's just maybe a one or two dimensional experience instead of, a multifaceted experience for me. I appreciate the special effects. The visualization of Rocky, for instance, is fantastic. I love the puppet work there. But I think maybe Ryan Gosling was a little too chummy and too like humor focused for me.
Okay. So I had a different take, and partly I'm sure it's because I didn't read the book. And I'm thinking of the author, and, perhaps the author was disappointed in the interpretation of their book, but I would think that the filmmaker, if they're making a film, is going to make their version of the book, and they're going to
Absolutely.
put in the parts that are important to them. So, what I liked about the film, and I really like this, is that there were a couple of really important overarching themes. So, we'll start with Ryan Gosling's character at the beginning. He's basically a coward. He has to be kidnapped, basically, and put on this spacecraft when the people who are supposed to go die in an accident. They drug him, they kidnap him, they put him on the plane, they don't give him a choice. And he's a coward because he knows that it's a suicide mission and he doesn't want to die, even though the world, in the premise of the movie, so the world is going to die at a certain point. But
Hmm.
even so, he's a coward and he doesn't want to do it. He refuses. So the first thing is that he's a coward. And he's a coward because he has nothing to motivate him to be brave. And then he meets Rocky, and Rocky, even though he's an alien, and I think that's really an important thing, and so different, teaches Ryan Gosling's character about how to have empathy and how to be brave, because Rocky sacrifices a lot. He risks death to save Ryan Gosling's life after a mission that succeeded, but with consequences to Ryan Gosling's health. And then Ryan Gosling sacrifices a lot and risks his life to save Rocky's planet. And I think that the thing I love the most is his arc from being this selfish coward. Yes, he loved science, he loved teaching science, but this selfish, cowardly guy who is forced into a situation, a real hero's journey, forced into this situation, not of his choosing, goes into a strange world, but then he meets this teacher who is an alien, and this teacher shows him how to be a person, right? This alien actually shows him how to be a person with compassion, with empathy, with self-sacrifice, with altruism, with heroism. And he does incredibly heroic things modeled after Rocky's heroism. So that part I just adored, and how they really came to love each other. And and how their love transcended not having a common language, not having common anything, like a rock creature and a human. So I love the political message, which is that just because someone is different doesn't mean they're bad. And in fact, we can learn from them. Like I was mentioning in our last conversation about the movie Arrival,
Hmm.
and also about how important empathy, compassion, altruism, generosity, kindness are, and how you can have courage when you have a reason to be brave, right? He had no reason to be brave before because he just had himself. But when he had someone he loved, all of a sudden he could be incredibly brave in a self-sacrificing way. And he learned these things from his alien friend. So those are the parts of the film I just adored. And I think that message is so, 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 so important for our times because, our times have become incredibly self-centered and people are talking about how empathy is a weakness. And, this movie is really saying empathy is our greatest superpower because it saves the world.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I agree with the power of that message. I think in terms of him, Rocky being an alien, and what that says about our world, and how different people with different perspectives can add to your knowledge. I think this is maybe one of the aspects that I think was underplayed a little bit, but throughout the story, Ryland has one set of information and Rocky has another set of information. And only by combining their knowledge can they, solve all these scientific problems. And that's a fascinating side of things. Rocky not knowing what radiation, or his people not knowing what radiation is such a tragic end to his crew. But they're able to figure out those problems because Ryland knows what radiation is. Little things like that, I think, are very clever and speak to, yes, you may not be able to communicate with someone as well as maybe you and I can communicate, but with a little effort, you find out that the differences are not, not as distant as you might, think, and that you can learn a lot from someone who has a different perspective. I love all that. Yeah, I think that is one of the most, probably the most powerful aspect of this, and that friendship is really endearing as well. I think one thing that, again, not to dwell on this adaptation, but I'm going to because it's the thing that I think about most. But one thing that I would have liked more of, I think, is the character played by Sandra Hüller, who is Eva Straight, who is, at least in the book, is very doesn't have a sense of humor. There's no conversation about asking about whether she believes in God or anything like that. She's just to the point, does not smile, maybe has a very dry sense of humor, if anything, and
Yeah.
has no regrets about really doing what must be done. And I think that's maybe softened a little in the movie to the point where, you know, she's singing karaoke and things like that, which is fine. But I do think that in the movie it works simply because she is seeing what Ryland's problems are before he does, I think. You know, she's seeing what you're recognizing, that he has no one, and he's actually the perfect person for this, and he needs to be forced into it. It's kind of for his own good, in a way, talking about his just emotional, I mean, in a way,
Yeah.
for his emotional growth, I should say.
Well, I don't know if she did it for his own good. She did it for the world. But
Right.
I was going to mention her character because I loved her character. And look, this is a Hollywood movie, don't forget. So to have a character that dour and that hard-assed and that, uncompromising and that willing to sacrifice someone else's life, for the cause, I think she was wonderful because she wasn't played as a villain. She's the scientist who's responsible for this mission to save the world. So she's got a huge weight on her shoulders. And yeah, like you said, she's just doing what has to be done to save the planet. But I loved the way it was played. I loved the way she was so like she was a serious person. And
Mhm.
I actually really liked the way her seriousness played off Ryan Gosling's goofiness because he was a kind of a goofy guy. But
Yeah.
I think that was just the personality that they wanted from him. They just wanted him to be this kind of a goofy, nerdy guy, like not a serious guy, who had to learn some gravitas and some deeper qualities. But I thought her character was really, really interesting because she wasn't nice. She wasn't kind. She wasn't soft, but she was doing the right thing. So it was a very interesting counterpoint. This person who was willing to do the wrong thing for the right cause. And, I don't know if that's something we want to model, but I think in the circumstances she was in, her behavior was understandable. We can definitely understand why she had to go to those extremes. I mean, the people who volunteered for the mission knew they were going to die and they volunteered. People were going to incredible extremes in this end of world scenario. And the only person who didn't want to go to the extremes was Ryan Gosling's character, Ryland, because, he's a goofy coward. But he ended up, going to the same kinds of extremes in the end in terms of, the mission, in terms of saving the life of Rocky, etc. So I think everyone was put in this extreme position. And I thought it was psychologically very accurate how it portrayed people in these extreme situations and what would be their reaction. Then you see a different type of reaction. You see the volunteers who are heroic. You see Eva's choice to be like a tough, 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 uncompromising leader, and Ryan Gosling's choice, which is to like, I'm not playing. It really demonstrated a variety of different responses to this extreme, extreme situation where our backs are against the wall and the world is about to end. And then how do people respond? And I imagine that that's exactly how us humans would respond in the same situation. There would be people like her, there would be people like the heroes, there would be people like Ryan Gosling who just opt out. I'm just going to look at TikTok until the end of the world, right? Because there's
Right.
nothing I
Yeah.
can do. And seriously, so I think it was really interesting for them to show these different types of reactions to this kind of pressure and how, even though Ryland started out one way, the journey, the literal journey and this internal journey changed him. So he was capable of being changed. So I guess he would be like the lowest level responder. The heroes were obviously fabulous. She was doing what she had to do and he was like, eh. But he went from, the lowest level of responder to the crisis to the very highest level of responder, willing to sacrifice everything to save his friend and the world. So I like that too.
I like the idea that when put, I think humanity really advances when we're put through like these huge conflicts, and left to our own devices, we would probably just sort of, I don't know, not advance at all, really, I
Do what
guess.
we're doing these
Yeah,
days.
exactly. So unfortunately, I think you need crisis or just conflict in order to advance. I think this is kind of something that's maybe happening in filmmaking in general, is that filmmakers have all these tools to make filmmaking easier, and yet somehow movies are less interesting, I think, on the whole. And so you never get, like, I won't say never, but you get fewer movies that are, inventive by necessity, I guess. And that necessity breeds invention, usually, as the saying goes. And so, you don't get movies that are working on a shoestring budget that look like they're on a shoestring budget, yet are doing things that are very inventive. You can do anything now with, I'm sure AI filmmakers are going to be trying this, unfortunately, but with CGI or whatever, you can put anyone in any world and it can look fantastic. And I think this is kind of maybe, you could argue that this is maybe a metaphor for independent filmmakers who are put in a situation where they have to tell a story or, save the world, I guess is the metaphor for that, and push themselves in directions that they've never thought of doing. Whereas right now they just don't seem to have any limitations whatsoever. So that's something I was thinking about today when I was watching it, was like how he's forced into this situation and kind of, yes, he has all this knowledge inside of him, but to be able to apply that knowledge in creative ways is a really fascinating outcome of it.
Yeah, and I totally agree that, our ingenuity, comes out of necessity, like you say, out of being pushed. And, in terms of creativity, like we need the friction, we need the conflict, we need the challenge, the difficulty. And, if you go to a writing workshop and they say write about anything, people just sit there, they don't know what to write about. So the teacher
Yeah.
has to give them a very specific prompt. Write about eating a bowl of spaghetti, but you don't have a fork. You know?
Yeah.
Like, how would you write about that, right? Like make it hard. And so the harder they make it, the better it is, because we are forced to be creative, like you said. So that trait for human beings, like that, adversity brings out the best in us.
Mm-hmm.
The heroism, the altruism, the kindness. Like the other day, someone was saying how, they were in the bad weather, in the heat, people were, helping each other out on the streets of Toronto. And it was like just a lot of helping. People were doing a lot of helping of each other. And, that kind of situation brought out the good qualities in us. So we are brought to our best under adversity. And yes, in art or in politics or in science, if there is no challenge, then we kind of stagnate. And so, yeah, I think in the movie, the challenge was the end of the world. But in creativity and filmmaking, the challenge is resisting the easy way, right? And then let the challenge be inherent in creating something, as opposed to just like have all the tools. But I totally agree with you that things get less interesting and less rich and less meaningful and just not worth the time if there's too much facility.
Yeah. I think that's true of maybe life experience as well, as just, people with more life experience just have a richer, palette, I guess, to paint with. I think if you read a bad book or something like that, and it's clear like none of the emotions resonate, or watch a bad movie where it's just like, oh, this is kind of a pastiche of just things I've seen before. Maybe it's made by someone who hasn't had a lot of life experiences and just watched a lot of movies, and they're just kind of replicating things that they love.
Regurgitating.
Yeah, I get that sense a lot when I see some movies, and it's just like, oh, there's nothing original here. There's no emotions. I think you can do plots that have been done over and over again as long as the emotions are true, and that I think is maybe lacking. So yeah, I think we're saying the same thing, that human beings are at their best when faced with conflict, and this is certainly that for Rylan.
And, you're really, what you're saying is, in terms of life experience, what you're saying is if we haven't suffered, it's very hard to know ourselves, and it's very hard to, have compassion. So we have to have suffered.
Yeah.
If we suffer, then we're a better artist. And it's not that we have to suffer to be an artist, but it's very hard to be a good artist if you haven't had any suffering. And, you live long enough, you'll suffer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just wait a little, wait 5 minutes. There will be suffering. You can't escape it. But in our movie, our character Rylance, he suffers. Like he really suffers in a way that he never has. He experiences loss, he experiences fear, he experiences horror, he experiences betrayal. Like he experiences all the bad feelings. And He suffers, and you see him at the very beginning. He's depressed. He's a mess. And then he pulls himself together and starts, using what he knows, which is science, to solve his problems. And then learning new skills about interacting and connecting to further solve his problems. But he suffered, and that suffering, was a good thing for him ultimately. It's not that we want to impose suffering on anyone, but like most people who have gone through an ordeal, a hardship, a trial, they say, I wouldn't have had it any other way because, I'm a better person, or I've learned so much, or so much good came out of it, whatever, and I don't think they're just saying it. I think they really mean it because it enriches us. So we would never wish suffering on anyone, but having suffered, we have more to offer as artists and as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cliche is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and yeah, that's true. I mean, tough skin is hard to develop, but when it's all over with, I think everybody comes out, better for that experience. So,
Yeah.
one thing that I thought was interesting in the way that they adapted this was that, and again, going back to the adaptation, sorry about that, but he wakes up with amnesia and has to kind of remember initially the mission that he was on. One thing that the book did differently was that it alternated between his memory of like something, he'd find something on the ship and that would prompt a memory, and then he'd have like a recall of how he learned that. And they kind of did that at the beginning of the movie, and then they just sort of forgot about it. And the structure of flashbacks was maybe just more for dramatic effect than actually being woven into the plot. But I'm wondering, just how you saw that as someone who didn't read the book, and did that amnesia element kind of unfolding, was that clear to you, or was that sort of, I don't know. I feel like they forgot about it after about 20 minutes. So
They probably realized that they just didn't have enough time to take it all the way through because,
sure.
there's too many things. A book you can just, have as long as you want, but a movie
Right.
has a time limit unless you want to be like an auteur and have people sitting through 3 hours. And it was already really long, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I think they probably just ran out of time. But I think that it felt very organic, that all those scenes, it felt like the whole movie was like a series of journeys. First
Mhm.
there was the journey of his refusal and his abduction. And then there was the journey of his waking up and, coming to awareness. Then there was the journey of his building this relationship. Then there was a journey of their solving the problem. Then there was the journey of saving each other's life. And then there was the final journey where he's like teaching the little kids on Rocky's planet. So I feel like the whole movie was a series of journeys, and I think each one was handled well. The fact that he chose to go home versus stay, I don't think that's as important because like, it was clear that he was a teacher and he was going to be a teacher wherever he was. So that to me was, that's just who he is. He knows he's a scientist and he's a teacher, and he was giving back, he was giving back before he went home. He was contributing in a positive way for the kids. And I thought that was lovely. And those kids were so cute. Oh my gosh. I mean,
Yeah.
Rocky was so cute, but baby versions of him were like super cute. But anyway, that's an aside. I mean,
Sure.
they
Yeah.
did a beautiful job. They did a beautiful job on the aliens. But I didn't think it was a problem that he chose to go home. I think, he always had wanted to go home, and that was his reward in a sense, and Hollywood needs a little bit of a happy ending. So.
I think so. Yes, Hollywood needs a happy ending, and I think a happy ending for mainstream audiences is going home, and they
Yes.
can't they can't eliminate the possibility of going home. Whereas I think they could have. I think audiences could have handled that just as I think they could have handled the science, and it would have been just as entertaining. I mean, The Martian was, wonderfully entertaining and didn't skimp on the science at all. So
That's Hollywood underestimating the intelligence of their audience and
yeah,
and even
yeah.
the stomach for certain things.
Yeah. So as you were talking about all these kind of, progressions that he's making, you listed, I think it's interesting that you listed his betrayal first because that's kind of chronologically what happens. But in the story, this is in the last 20 minutes of the movie. Like he just wakes up on the station in the beginning, and
Right.
you don't find out that he was drugged and put on the ship until 20 minutes is left. So I think it's interesting that that as you're talking about it, you're resituating the story in a chronological way, but the viewer doesn't find out until the very end that he was that
You
he was
don't?
no.
Oh,
I
that's so interesting.
yeah.
I thought we knew in the beginning that he had been drugged.
No,
No, eh?
he just
Okay.
wakes up on the ship and he doesn't know why he's there and he's trying to figure it
And
out.
then it's flashing back.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
so interesting because, yeah, I remember it that it started out with him being drugged and dragged onto the ship.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
I,
Um,
I uh, reordered it in my memory.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting that you're I don't know that you've reordered it in such a way where you're seeing this as his growth, but it's sort of like a recall effect where only retroactively as you're thinking about it are you able to kind of put together that yes, that's his real journey is kind of like a hero's journey versus him just trying to figure out the science of the situation. That sort of just comes in the last 20 minutes, right when the movie needs it, right when you know he has to overcome that final thing and go back and save Rocky. Now he's becoming a hero and becoming selfless, even though he was forced to do it. So that those kind of two ideas are in such close proximity in the way the narrative is arranged.
I guess because I'm so focused on the hero's journey, so I'm
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
seeing it that way.
yeah.
But yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah. Well, whether it came at the beginning or the end, I think the concept of him being forced into it is so important because so often we are forced into these situations. We don't choose to be heroes a lot of the times. There are people who choose to be heroes, but most of us end up being heroic just because we stumble into it or we get pushed into it or twist our arm twisted into it. We got voluntold, and then we end up rising to the occasion. And I think in terms of a story, I enjoy more the reluctant hero than
Oh,
the,
sure.
the gung ho hero because it's, the resistance makes it more interesting. Again, there's more conflict, there's more challenge because they don't want to be a hero. Like he's very clear, I don't want to do this. I'm no hero. I'm a coward. I'm not going into it, and then like too bad, it's done. So I love that. I love that part because it's very true to life. We are thrust into these situations out of our volition and then we have to rise. And most of the time we do, which is the beautiful thing about humanity. So I love that part about the movie too. So I'm glad you brought that up to, to remind me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about this today, just how strange it is that that element is introduced so late. But I think it reveals a lot about the character and his growth at that moment. So yeah, it's an interesting arc for him.
Yeah. So in terms of human growth and in terms of like human character, I think the movie got it spot on. And in terms of empathy and connection and the relationship, all that stuff, I think they totally got. So from the psychological point of view, for me as a psychiatrist, I give it an A. Like I have no problems. Not having read the book, I have nothing to compare it to and be disappointed by. And I know
Yeah.
it's very hard. Look, it's very hard to compare a movie to a book. They're such different animals.
Hmm.
And a lot of times people read the book and, it's just not the same. And I've certainly read the book and looked at a movie and gone, but it's like I think it's doing a disservice to ourselves because a movie is a thing in and of itself. And
Hmm.
if we can just look at it on its own terms, I think we're more prone to enjoying it. But I do agree with you that Hollywood does kind of spoon feed us a little too much and does underestimate us a little too much. And wouldn't it be nice if they had a little bit more faith in their audience? But I guess the stakes are so high now for Hollywood that they're being even more cautious at a time when it probably would serve them better to be a little less so. And what was that studio who hired these two visionaries? They're the one who put Paul Thomas Anderson's movie out recently, One Battle
Oh,
After Another.
oh, sure. I know who you're talking about. Yeah, it was Warner Brothers that put out that film, and they also released. They're making big gambles on auteurs. So they're,
Yes.
the Ryan Coogler film Sinners,
Yes.
the Bong Joon Ho film Mickey 17, just huge $100 million productions that maybe don't play by these rules. And I think, The Odyssey is another great example of a, huge spectacle that is non-chronological and has three different timelines. It's this classical adventure that most people, probably haven't read that happened to make, a ridiculous amount of money over this last weekend. So, yeah, I think you can take risks. And I will say that I don't normally dwell on adaptation and what the movie got wrong. For me, this was, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, there were just, I think, some ideological shifts where there was a kind of religious element, I think, introduced into the film that wasn't there in the book. Just calling him Grace, for instance, asking questions about God to Strat. I think even over the end credits, there was sort of a religious song played.
Oh,
I mean, just all these little elements. It's like we need to make this work for Middle America is kind of what some studio executives said. So, we can't just have it be science first. And I think that is a reflection of maybe kind of what's going on in the U.S. today. So just in terms of what I was able to draw out of the book versus how I saw those changes unfold in the film really sort of suggested to me that they were trying to play to today's America, which was a whole lot different, I think, than 10 years ago when The Martian came out and they were allowed to be, science forward and portray a world, for instance, in The Martian where all governments were just working on space together and they cared about that together and they all came together to work on that. That's really inspiring to me. And that kind of happens here. Maybe not as much in the movie as in the book, but it's still kind of an inspiring element that I would highly recommend you read the book. I think you'd enjoy it. And the dimensions of Rocky and Ryland's relationship are much more vast, I think, in the book. So
as they tend to be in fiction.
Yeah.
But this being a film, as a film, and from my perspective, I enjoyed it. And, I felt like the message was valuable and that the psychological aspects were accurate. So I had no problem with it on that level.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know this is a beloved movie that people, I'm very much in the minority of not, loving this movie. And my reasons are very weird for me in the sense that I don't normally let this sort of thing, shape my opinion. But for whatever reason, I'm imperfect.
We feel what we feel. No, we feel what we feel, and taste is very subjective, and our preferences, and the things that bother us, and the things that we like, and that's what makes us who we are, and we shouldn't have to change that. Like I think, you be you, right? I don't have a problem with you having your opinion.
Thanks.
we often don't agree, but we still have great conversations. So and I think our disagreements actually make for a fun conversation. So
right, it's a little boring if we're just agreeing with each other the whole time.
That was good. 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, right. No notes. Yep.
Well, that was really fun talking about Project Hail Mary with you, Brian Eggert. And thanks again for coming on the Real Mental podcast.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. And while you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 180 episodes and counting. If you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening.